All right, so let's move along with Buffalo Harbor, Lake Sturgeon, and Chris Legard.
So I guess I get the honor of giving the last sturgeon talk of the day, and it's only fitting that it's our local sturgeon population that spawns right here in the city of Buffalo. And some of it's going to be the same old sturgeon story that we've heard about all day, but I think some of it's going to be a little bit different too. Buffalo Harbor is a historic spawning location for Lake Sturgeon and Lake Erie, and it's supported in intense commercial fishery, pretty much the same story that we saw around Lake Erie, but Buffalo is kind of unique in that when the fishery peaked in the 1880s, I think the highest landings for Lake Erie, this graph shows the total Lake Sturgeon landings for Lake Erie, was a little over 5 million pounds, and in 1885, 3.6 million of those pounds were landed here in Buffalo. So Buffalo was really kind of the center of the Lake Sturgeon commercial fishery in the late 1800s. And it's also unique in that the commercial fishery kind of followed the same trend where it rapidly declined in the early 1900s, but it persisted in a very low level all the way up until the fishery was closed in 1976. And there were only a couple of people still out there in the 70s, but they were still landing 200 or 300 pounds a year. So that's kind of unique in New York, I think. And then, of course, the fishery was closed in 1976, and the species was subsequently listed as threatened in the state. And even though there was a small fishery that persisted through the 70s, all through the 80s and 90s, Lake Sturgeon were pretty rare in Lake Erie, but one of the only ways that we really encountered them was when people would call up and say that a big dead one had washed up on the beach. And that happened rare enough that the folks at the Lake Erie Fisheries Unit would send somebody out there and they would take a look at it and gather whatever kind of biological information they could from these dead fish. And these were pretty rare, in the 80s and 90s there was one fish here, one fish there, and several years of no fish. Then there was a botulism outbreak in Lake Erie in 2001, and 27 dead Lake Sturgeon were reported in eastern Lake Erie. So that was one of the first kind of pieces of information that maybe there were more sturgeon out there than we had really thought at that time. Then in 2011, we started getting reports of people, anglers, actively targeting and catching Lake Sturgeon in Buffalo Harbor. So Don Einhaus and Mike Clancy decided to go out there and set a couple of nets and see if we could effectively sample these fish. And the two old timers managed to put a couple of fish Then from 2012 to 2016, over the last 5 years, we've been running a full-on Lake Sturgeon sampling program in Buffalo Harbor. We start the survey every year when the water temperature reaches 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 degrees Celsius for those of you from Canada. And we fish for about 2 weeks and use a combination of gill nets and set lines. The gill nets vastly outperform set lines in Buffalo Harbor, so the set line program was abandoned after 2014. Out of all the fish that we catch, we try and gather every piece of information we can from them and measure them all for total length, fork length, girth, weight, take big ray samples for aging, tissue samples for genetic testing, outfit them with buoy tags, pit tags, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service for the last few years. Some of the fish have been tagged with satellite pop-up archival tags and surgically implanted with acoustic telemetry tenders. So we really kind of put these fish through the ringers. So after 5 years of trying to gather every piece of information of every fish that we caught, what have we actually learned about these fish? We've caught a total of 149 fish. 95 of them are males, 5 of them are known to be females, and 49 of them we were unable to determine sex in the field. Those numbers are just a little bit different than the ones Jonah showed because he showed our combined catches, and this is only the DEC catches. Out of those 149 fish, we've gotten 10 recaptures, which actually isn't too bad, given that we've only got 149 fish tagged out there. We know something about the length and the growth of the fish. We know that the females are longer and heavier than the males. The largest female, the longest female that we've got was 1,910 millimeters, and the heaviest was 65 kilograms. And even though the males tend to be smaller than the females, some of the males get really big. The biggest male that we caught was 1,786 millimeters and weighed 54 kilograms. I'll get there. We also know a little bit about the age of the fish. So we took fin rate samples from all the fish that we caught, and we found that almost all of the fish that are spawning in Buffalo tend to be less than 20 years of age. We've got some fish that are in their later 20s and into their 30s, and one big old female that was estimated to be 84 years of age. And then Jonah caught a big old female there this year too, that's probably right up there. Using just a really basic Schnabel marker capture, we can estimate that there's somewhere between 450 and 1,500 individuals in the population. You saw Dimitri's talk, you see that there's all kinds of issues with trying to do marker capture estimates, and it kind of requires more complicated models and things to get an accurate representation. So just take this number with a grain of salt and know that there are a lot of issues. And in Buffalo, I think those issues are further compounded by the fact that we can only catch fish, even though the telemetry data has showed that some of them are spending a lot of time in the area, we can only catch them for a couple of weeks during the spawning season. So given spawning periodicity for females that might only spawn every 5 to 7 years, for our sampling program that started in 2012, we'd have to sample until 2018 just to have one chance to mark all the females in the population. Then we would have to continue to 2025 to have one chance to recapture them. That's right. So given all of this information, we know a little bit about the age of the fish, the size of the fish. We have some type of a WAG, at least, of how many there might be out there. What is a fish manager to do with this information? And more specifically, is the information that we've gotten from 5 years of sampling effort good enough to make any type of management decisions? Or do we need to have decades of long-term monitoring before we can actually say anything about it? And as much as I like long-term monitoring, I think it's important that we should do it. I'm going to try and make the case that we can make some management decisions based off of the data that we have from a relatively short-term sampling program. And then we can do that by looking at the age structure and the sex ratio and some of the population demographics that we know about the fish in Buffalo and comparing them to other populations elsewhere that are being healthy enough to support a recreational fishery. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of other places that have sturgeon that can support a fishery. One example is the Rain River in the Lake of the Woods system in Minnesota. And they have a catch and release fishery and a limited harvest fishery there. The graph on the left shows the age distribution of spawning fish in the Rain River, and the one on the right is the spawning, or the age distribution of fish spawning in Buffalo. And see in the Rain River, almost all the fish that are spawning are less than 30 years of age. There's a few older ones out there. In Buffalo, our fish are a little bit younger than that, but fit the same pattern of a lot of young fish in the spawning grounds. The fish in Buffalo that we have are heavily skewed towards males. It's kind of the same situation in the Rain River. The big difference here is that they have a lot more fish than we do. For their population estimate is around 29,000 fish of adult size, where ours is only around 1,000. The next example is Black Lake, Michigan, where they have a very limited harvest-oriented fishery. I think the quota for 2017 is like 7 fish. It's predominantly a spear fishery through the ice. These graphs on the top show the age structure of the males, and the bottom shows the females. Again, almost all the males in the population that are spawning are less than 30 years of age, and the majority of the females that are on the spawning grounds are less than 4 years of age, although there are some older females present in the spawning population. The sex ratio is not as skewed as ours is, or that of the Rainy River, but is still skewed towards males. And this population estimate is very similar to ours, where they think there's only about 1,100 spawning adults in the population, but they still have a limited harvest-oriented fishery. My last example is Lake Winnebago. So Ron, if you're back there, I cherry-picked a couple things out of a paper you published in 1999. But if I got it wrong, please tell me. out of that paper, it showed that they aged 407 males, and only 4 of them were over 30 years of age, and 312 females, only 11 of them were over 40 years of age. And they also had a sex ratio skewed heavy towards males, and there was a really lot more fish in Lake Winnebago, where the estimate was around 51,000 fish. So my kind of management takeaway from this is that the concerns we have about our population in buffalo is that the spawners seem to be dominated by young fish. We have a male-dominated system where we don't see very many females in our survey, and we don't have all that many fish there. But given that, I would say that by looking at some of these other populations, the spawning populations, I'm talking about sampling fish actually on the spawning grounds, that those spawning aggregations tend to be dominated by young males, so what we're seeing actually looks like what it seems to look like everywhere else. And our population estimate is very small, but I imagine that it probably underestimates the population based on only sampling for a few years, and it probably certainly underestimates the population of fish throughout eastern Lake Erie, because this is the only known spawning location in eastern Lake Erie, but there very well could be other locations. And I'm going to go ahead and just put it out there as a point of discussion at least, that by looking at the structure of our population and comparing it to other places that have a fishery, I would say that we probably don't have enough fish to support a harvest-oriented fishery in buffalo, but that if Lake Sturgeon were ever removed from the threatened species list in New York, we probably could support a catch and release fishery here. And I would argue that we'd probably learn more about those populations through the angler information than we'll probably ever learn through a limited netting program. And then with that, I'll take questions and also sit quietly while people tell me I'm doing
I'll be kind. We'll talk later. I just coming from a marine background, have you compared that population and age structure to non-fishery oriented populations? Because harvest fisheries tend to trim off the population structure. So that would be my only concern with what you displayed. That it's good data. I'm actually pretty impressed by what you got.
Yes, I haven't. Actually did this last week. We kind of thought, how can I come up with something to talk about at AFS? That would be interesting and different than what everyone else is talking about. So I only kind of breezed through the literature pretty quick and cherry-picked a couple of questions. Anybody else?